Nobody wants to go to hell. We're all reaching for paradise. We're all trying to climb the mountain. Both comedy and tragedy, they take us on this journey that leads us into these encounters with reality. What we need is difference. We need people that are different in our lives. We need exposure to different viewpoints. We need exposure to things that are outside of the circle of hell that we inhabit. Hey, welcome to The Golden Thread. My wife and I were rewatching The Office recently, and of course this is the American version with Steve Carell, and such a great show, a lot of fun. And back in the early 2000s, the show was something of a cultural phenomenon. It really it kind of exploded onto the scene, was very, very unique, and sort of pioneered this whole new style of sitcom, essentially, which was this kind of weird fusion of like reality TV and sitcom. And normally, like, I can't sit through a sitcom. Like, I'm just not a sitcom kind of guy, because there's a certain phoniness, right, to the sitcom that just is sort of inherent to that particular style of television, and I just can't. It's just too fake for me. I can't. But again, what The Office did that was so interesting was that it did this sort of weird fusion of the reality TV and the sitcom, where you know that you're watching a sitcom, but it hits close to home so many times, because it is so there is such a realism to it, and that is, I think, the nature of the comedy, as well as that the Office in a lot of ways is equally hilariously funny and unbelievably cringy at the same time. And what makes it so funny, so hilarious, and also so cringy is that kind of mixture of, sitcom kind of comedy mixed with reality. And it's so real. It's a little too real. It's almost kind of in that like uncanny valley of like, oh wow, that's actually very real. And they lean into the cringe. Like they never ease up. It's always leaning into the cringe, and which makes it sometimes difficult to watch, but also hilariously funny if that style of humor kind of speaks to you in a way. And for anybody who hasn't seen The Office, essentially, The Office is set in, essentially, it is in a lot of ways, it is a satire of kind of the modern sort of corporate world. And it takes place in an office, which is the sort of the headquarters of the Scranton branch, the Scranton, Pennsylvania branch of a paper company, which is essentially a struggling paper company that is trying to survive, but they're up against, the advent of the internet and some of the big paper chains like Office Depot and things like this, and so they're struggling to keep up. They're kind of a little bit archaic. They're behind the times. They're trying to adapt and struggling. But really, essentially, the comedy of the show and the drama and everything else revolves around the dynamics of the people who work in the office. And so you have this sort of office setting with, cubicles and water coolers and all of that kind of stuff. And then you have this sort of revolving cast of characters who all have their own little quirks and, little strange things about them. And they interact with one another in lots of funny and cringy kinds of ways. And it's very, very funny. But what I was thinking about as we were watching it is, particularly in some of the episodes that lean not so much into the comedy, but into the cringe. And it is from the cringe that the comedy then sort of bleeds through, if you will. I was thinking a little bit about this sort of strange relationship between comedy and tragedy. That a lot of times we see that comedy and tragedy, you would think of them as being at like either end of the spectrum, at opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to storytelling. But in a lot of ways they are, but also in a lot of ways they are kind of very strangely related to one another. They're actually in some ways very similar sort of styles of storytelling. And similarly, and when we are engaged in a comedy or whether we're engaged in a tragedy, a lot of times it moves us to a certain expression of emotion, right? So if it's a comedy, if the comedy is doing what the comedy is supposed to do, it makes you laugh, right? If the tragedy is doing what it's supposed to do, it makes you cry. And that sort of impulse to either laugh or cry or express this emotion, I think, comes from a very similar sort of place, which is that in one way or another, both the comedy and the tragedy are telling us something that is true about the world. And so when we encounter whatever that thing might be, so if it's a comedy, right? Someone, there's a joke, there's something that's funny, and the reason why it strikes us as funny is because we say, oh yeah, right, that's true, right? Like there's something about it that we recognize and identify and be like, and are like, okay, yeah, that's right, that's exactly the way the world is, and we laugh. On the other hand, if it's told in a sort of a tragic sort of way, we look and we see a thing and we identify it in ourselves, or we identify it with an experience that we've had, or that we can at least imagine having in our lives, and we say, oh my goodness, right, that is true, and it moves us, and we can empathize with it, and we can feel the pain of that sort of situation, whatever that situation might be. Similarly, we were watching, there's a new Toy Story movie, so we were going back and rewatching some of the older Toy Story movies, and there's certain moments, these Pixar stories, right, they just get you in the feels, and there's certain moments in these stories that just, I cannot help just bawling my eyes out. It just hits me in a certain place. I'm not even sure why. There's just something in there, but I was reflecting on it when I was watching one of these scenes in one of these films, and I was like, man, what is it about that hits me so hard? I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's something about it that that speaks of truth to me, that it's just like, it's true, and it's an encounter with reality. That both comedy and tragedy, they take us on this journey that leads us into these encounters with reality. And when that happens, there's this moment of connection, and that sometimes expresses itself through laughter, or sometimes it expresses itself through tears. And as we were watching The Office and The Office in some ways kind of blurs the line between comedy and tragedy, right? It's like it is both things at the same time, and it lives in that sort of weird tension between the two. And I was reminded as we were watching it, sort of strangely, and this will be a sort of an interesting connection to follow here, but I was reminded sort of strangely of another story, a very old story, that also blurs the lines between comedy and tragedy and has some similarities in a strange way. And that is the Divine Comedy, what's called the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, who was an Italian poet from the 14th century. So he's a medieval poet, and he writes this work of epic poetry, basically, that is 3 volumes, that is 3 parts, and it follows the journey of this character who is Dante himself. He imagines himself in this role as the protagonist. It follows this journey of this character as he makes the descent down into the underworld, that he goes down into hell, essentially, and then from out of hell he rises and ascends again and goes to purgatory, and then eventually to paradise as well. And the three parts of the story are the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, and so it follows this kind of journey of the descent down and then back up again. And we've been talking here lately about this idea of the descent, of the hero's journey, that in order for the hero to rise, in order for him to ascend, to go up, to climb the mountain, to ascend to the goal of the journey, the destiny, whatever it is, the shining city on the hill, he has to first be willing to go down through that dark valley. And it's very interesting when you read the Divine Comedy how this story progresses, and it's actually the first part of the story, not the conclusion as much, that is most iconic and is most remembered. It is the Inferno that is actually the part that you think that people remember the most, and you would think it would be Paradise, right? You'd think it would be the heavenly conclusion, and again, it's all great, right? It's all this masterpiece, but there's something about the Inferno, his depiction of hell, that has captivated people for generations and generations, and it's sort of strange in that way, right? It's strange that it's called the Divine Comedy, because in a lot of ways it's actually kind of a horror story, right? At least that Inferno part of things. It is the tragedy. It is the horror of the fallenness of mankind, of the state in which we find ourselves, in this sort of hellish state. But it's interesting that we as human beings seem to be able to identify more easily and more readily with the hellish sort of landscape, with the descent, with the darkness, than with the light. And I think also, as an artist, I think that it's easier in some ways to depict the depths, to depict darkness and tragedy and horror, than it is actually to depict paradise, which makes a lot of sense, really, when you think about it, because if we're thinking about ascending, if we're thinking about heaven, if we're thinking about reaching for that which is higher, which is above, we have to stretch for it, right? Like anytime that you reach for something that's above you, you have to climb the ladder, you have to climb the stairs, you have to reach, you have to jump, and there's a potential to fall, right? And not be able to quite reach, or not be able to stretch, or not be tall enough, or not be able to get up high enough. And so it's easy to fall, but it's hard to reach those heights that we want to reach. And so I think in the same way, we instinctively are more it's easier to depict what hell might be like than it is. We almost just catch little glimpses of heaven, right? There's little moments in stories where you get this little taste of something really, truly beautiful, and the same in life. We get these moments of the real beautiful, kinds of things. But the fall, right, is something that we know all too well. But in the case of the Inferno, really Dante depicts this sort of descent downward into hell that is really, really iconic. That is, it's very, very gripping. It's very, very powerful, and it's also what makes the Inferno really uncomfortable reading. And it's the same thing that makes The Office such uncomfortable watching, because we see ourselves in it. It's so relatable. It leans into the realism. And Dante, as he was telling the story, he actually, in a lot of ways, the reason why this kind of seemingly, more tragic sort of story actually shades into comedy is because he satirizes his own culture, essentially, right? In this medieval European culture in which he's living, he places modern, for him, contemporary figures in hell, and he essentially lampoons these characters, or he points out, he uses this sort of this stylistic parody as a way of essentially pointing out sins and corruption in the world around him, in much the same way that The Office sort of is this parody of the modern landscape. It is showing what the corporate world kind of looks like in this very sort of withering kind of way, where it's all just cubicles and petty, sort of squabbling and even just, trying to sell paper, right? It's like and yet people are so like invested in this, and then are trying to get other people to be invested in this as they're going about, selling their product and all of that. And in a lot of ways, it is this sort of very funny kind of lampooning and depiction of the modern world in the same sort of way, or in a kind of interestingly similar way to how Dante sort of depicts his world. But when we tie this into this idea of the hero's journey, right, this idea of the descent, that we all in our lives, we are all kind of reaching for something, right? We're all reaching for paradise. We're all trying to climb the mountain. We're all trying to escape from the rat race. We're reaching for whatever that thing is. But in order to get there, it's necessary for us first to go down, right? That it's necessary for us to make the descent, just as it is in Dante's Inferno, that the character of Dante, he has to go down before he can go up. He has to make the descent downwards into this dark place before he can get to the other side. We have to be willing to descend into hell before we can rise to heaven. We see this also in the Christ story, right? We see this in the Passion story, where Christ essentially is this figure, this divine figure who, in a sense, his whole life is a descent, right? It is the descent, the incarnation, the Christian idea of the incarnation is this idea of a descent, that the God who came down from heaven and was born in a cave, in a stable, and lived among men. And then at the center of that story, at the center of that descent, there is the centerpiece of the story, which is the Passion narrative itself. It is the crucifixion and the resurrection. And in that sort of microcosm of this larger story, we see that Christ has to first die. He has to first be humiliated. He has to descend into the valley of humiliation. He has to be mocked. He has to be beaten and crucified and betrayed and all of those things. And then he has to go down even further. He has to go down into the grave. He has to be buried in a tomb. And then the tradition has it that even it goes even further than that he actually has to go all the way down, that Christ has to descend into the Inferno. He has to descend into hell itself in order to harrow hell and to deliver the souls from bondage. And then only after this has taken place can he then begin the ascent again with resurrection and the return, and then the ascension back to, as it says, to the right hand of glory, or the right hand of power. Like, that's the story of the Passion narrative. And in a lot of ways, like, that is the story of the world. Like, that is what is the pattern of reality, essentially, that we have to be willing to go down before we can ascend to the heights that we want to go. And so we have to experience the horrors, just as Christ does. He has to experience the horrors of the grave before he can experience the beauties and the glory of paradise. But here's the thing that's so fascinating, and this is where we can tie this in with the Inferno and with The Office as well, is that there is, on this journey, as we are kind of all kind of in that process of descending and ascending, that there is a tendency for us to get stuck. That we as people, we tend to be going along the journey and then we get trapped, or we get stuck, or we get lost. We see this at the beginning of the story of the Inferno. We've seen this in the story of the Odyssey as well, where the hero is going along. He loses his way, and in the Inferno, the story begins where the hero has lost his way. He's wandered from the straight path and has fallen asleep, and he's asleep in this dark wood, right? And so there's this state of being sort of stuck, being dreaming, being sort of caught in this place. And it's necessary for the hero first to awaken. The hero first has to awaken from the sleep. He has to break free from whatever it is that's holding him or her in this specific place, so that he or she can begin that journey again. And whether that's descending down or whether that's the journey back up again. And we see this idea of getting stuck portrayed to both comic and tragic in both comic and tragic ways in both The Office and in the Inferno. And in the Inferno, we see this depiction. When we see the depiction of hell, it's a really fascinating depiction. And the depiction of hell in the Inferno essentially is that hell is depicted as what is essentially an inverted mountain, right? So if you have a mountain, right, so that this is the peak, right? We have the symbol of the mountain of God, the ascent, right, that goes up to this point, this apex that we're climbing towards. Well, hell is the reverse of that. Hell is if you inverted it and it went down, right? So it's the inverted mountain, so it's a pit that goes downward. And it just keeps going down and down. But it doesn't go down vertically, right? It's not just a straight drop, not a straight descent. Rather, it's a gradual descent that goes down in this sort of cyclical pattern, right? So you can imagine as a spiral staircase that goes down and down and down and down. And we see this, this in a lot of ways is representative of our intuitions and I think of our experience of the pattern of life, that people don't just immediately plunge into hell. Generally speaking, right? It can happen, but for the most part, we don't really see that. There's the old adage, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, or C.S. Lewis in his excoriating satire, The Screwtape Letters, he talks about hell being the long, slow descent without signposts or without, any kind of dramatic drops or anything like that. But rather just this long, slow, so you don't even know that it's happening. You're just kind of slowly, sort of the frog in the boiling water, right? You're just going down, down, down. And so in the case of Dante's depiction of hell, it's this cyclical sort of pattern that just goes slowly, slowly down. Jordan Peterson talks about this when he's talking about the idea of Jacob's ladder. So there's this biblical image of this idea of a ladder that goes upward, right? It's like the stairway to heaven. And a lot of times we typically think of this in our sort of, Western way. We think of it as like almost like an escalator in the mall, right? It's like it just goes straight up, right? You just get on the escalator, you go right up to heaven. But that's really not what the Jacob's ladder actually ought to be conceived of as. Rather, as Jordan Peterson explains this, that the Jacob's ladder is a spiral staircase. It goes up, right? But it goes up in circles. It goes up in cycles, upward and upward and upward. And that same stairway that goes upward all the way up to heaven, all the way up to the peak, it also runs all the way down. So it goes all the way up to heaven, but it goes all the way back down to hell as well. And that is the pattern of our lives. Because if you think about it, right? Like when we are living our lives, we're not, our lives are, we tend to see our lives as kind of like a linear trajectory, right? We think we're going along this path, but that's not really what it is. Rather, it's almost like we are going along a path, but it's like a corkscrew, right? We're constantly going in these circles, right? We're going in these cycles. And as we go along, each time that we go around, we have these patterns where, we do a thing and then we come around and we experience some other stuff. And then we find ourselves doing the same thing again, right? How many times do we find ourselves repeating the same patterns in our lives? How many times do we remind ourselves, or do we find ourselves saying the same things that we've said before, but maybe in a slightly different way, having a very similar conversation, but maybe with a different person, or we come to, or experiencing something, and each time it happens, and each time that it repeats, and we see this with history as well, right? History repeats itself, and we see the cyclical pattern of history down through the ages, but every time that it repeats itself, every time that the cycle comes around again, it's slightly different. It's never exactly the same. Hopefully it's not exactly the same, but each time it changes a little bit, and we can see how maybe we're learning, right? So we've in an ideal situation, we experience something, we have this cycle of going down, right? And then ascending back up again, right? We have the experience, and each time that we go through that cycle, we're learning a little bit more. And maybe that we make the mistake again, maybe if there's a mistake to be made, but maybe it's not quite as catastrophic as it was the last time. Maybe we've learned a little bit from our mistake and we avoid it a little bit more, and then we avoid it a little bit more, and it changes and it adapts. So we're growing. That's the spiral staircase. That's Jacob's ladder. That's the stairway to heaven, going up and up and up and up. But that staircase also goes down, right? We also see ourselves, in our most honest moments, we see ourselves repeating the same errors, repeating the same mistakes. And if we're going in the other direction, right? If we are deteriorating, whether that's morally or cognitively or physically or whatever it might be, if we're deteriorating, we find ourselves going the other way. We experience the same thing again. We fall again, but this time it's a little bit harder, right? We fall a little bit further. We slip a little bit more, and we go down and we go down and we go down. Well, that is Dante's depiction of hell, is that you could go all the way down to the bottom, right? And that is the pit. That we see Dante and his guide, who is the poet Virgil. The poet Virgil guides Dante down through these spirals and down all the way to the bottom. And so we see ourselves kind of repeating these same sorts of circles and cycles as we go through them. And here's the thing, is that a lot of times we think of that sort of thing, that the going down, as being the worst thing, right? Like if we find ourselves, and we do at times find ourselves in this pattern of descent, right? In this pattern of going down, down, down. And we think of that in a lot of ways as the pattern that we want most to avoid in the world, right? Like nobody wants to go to hell. like nobody wants to have to go down to the bottom and experience your life spiraling out of control and you're just going down faster and faster and faster and just everything's going down to the bottom. Like nobody wants to have to experience that. But here's the thing. That actually, I think that pattern, even though that's a destructive pattern and it's not good, right? Like we don't want it, we don't like it. Actually, in the ultimate sense, I think for all of our journeys, it is a necessary part of the journey. Like we have to actually make mistakes. We have to actually go down. We have to be willing to spiral to go down so that even though it's a negative direction, we don't want to be going there. Sometimes we have to get to the bottom of the pit in order to begin the upward trajectory, right? We can think of all the examples in our lives where it's like you talk about people having to get to the bottom of the barrel before all of a sudden they look at their situation and they say, you know what? This is no good. I cannot continue to repeat the same pattern. I need to turn my life around. We use this kind of language, right? Turning my life around, or whatever it might be. Repentance is sort of the spiritual or the religious word for it, but it literally means turning around and going the opposite way. And sometimes you have to get to the bottom. Sometimes you don't have to go all the way down. Sometimes you go a certain way down and then you're able to reorient yourself and begin to move back up. But you have to go down to some degree, because if we think about the different peaks of our lives, it's like you can think of your life as sort of like a mountain range, right? Where you can see the peaks in the distance of the places that you want to get. But between where you are now and where that peak is that you want to get, there's a valley. You have to be willing to descend into the valley or not be able to ascend or continue the journey at all. And that is the thing that is the scariest, right? And that is actually the depiction in Dante's Inferno that is the most horrifying, which is not the descent, right? Dante, the hero, is making the descent, and then we know he goes all the way down to the bottom, and then he begins the ascent again. And actually, it's interesting, as he goes all the way down to the bottom, he passes through all of these different circles and these different cycles. And what he goes through what he experiences is he sees people who are trapped in this particular cycle, right? So there's these different circles of hell, these 9 different circles. And in each one, there are people who are going round and round and round and round, but they're not escaping. They're stuck. They're stuck in this pattern. They're stuck in this never-ending loop, this cycle of self-destruction and misery and humiliation and suffering, but they can't get free because they've been caught in this cycle. And Dante doesn't get caught. He goes as a visitor. He sees it. He takes it as a warning, and then he continues the descent. But for us, if we're unwilling to continue to go down, if we're unwilling to continue the journey, we can get caught in a cycle. We think about it in ourselves, right? I mean, this is what addiction is, right? Like you think about addiction, or you think about self-destructive thought patterns, right? Or you think about relationships, where relationships get caught in this sort of thing, or you think about just all of the various kinds of ways in which we can get stuck in a situation in our lives. We think about anxiety, right? This sort of mental loop. We think about depression, this kind of continual spinning of the wheels, like all of these kinds of things. And it could be psychological patterns, they could be spiritual patterns, and there can be all kinds of things that cause us to get stuck, right? Trauma, right? You think about trauma. It's like trauma is a thing that causes you to keep reliving the same thing over and over and over again, right? And it's like we want to get free. We want to get free from that thing. But in order to get free from it, you have to confront it. You have to break free. There has to be this sort of move to break out of that cycle. And sometimes it means going down and facing the things that you don't want to face. And that's what causes us to resist, or one of the things that can be an obstacle to our making the descent is that we're afraid. We don't want to see what's down there at the bottom, right? Like we'd rather just keep going in circles. But here's the thing. That's worse. Like just going in circles forever and ever and ever is worse than making the descent and being willing to confront what's down there at the bottom. And that's what Dante does. He goes through the circles. He goes all the way down to the bottom. And at the bottom, it's interesting, is the devil, right? The devil is at the bottom. And it's interesting here because the devil is also stuck Right? The devil is this ultimate, is this depiction of that which is most corrupt, that which is most depraved, that which is most dark and twisted and all of the rest. And he's at the very, very bottom. But and here's this moment where Dante gets all the way to the bottom, and then he begins the ascent, right? He can get to the bottom. He comes face to face with the horrific vision, right? He sees the devil face to face. He sees how bad and how dark it can get. And then he turns around and he goes back up. But the devil doesn't, right? The devil stays there. Why? Because the devil is also trapped, essentially. And where the devil is trapped is he's trapped in bitterness. It's like he's gotten all the way down to the bottom. And that's a trap for us as well. That it's possible that the experiences of our life have become so destructive and so painful, and things have spiraled so far out of control. You can go all the way down to the bottom and then just stay there, right? And that's what it is to crash and burn, and then stay in that place, right? This is Milton, right? So Milton, Paradise Lost. Better to reign in hell than to be a slave in heaven is Satan's sort of motto, you could say. He'd rather be the king of the pit than to humble himself and then begin the journey back up again. He'd just rather stay at the bottom. And there's, instances of our lives where we maybe start to experience that sort of temptation. I'd rather... you see people who are stuck in a really miserable situation, but it just almost seems like they've just chosen to stay there. There's almost this kind of weird satisfaction of being at the bottom. And that's a trap. Like, we don't want to get caught in that, right? We need to be willing to go to the bottom, but then to be able to experience the humiliation and then the repentance of the return and the journey beginning back up again. But again, even on the return journey, we still have to be careful because you can still get caught in a cycle. You can still get caught. Even if you're going upward, at some point you might just get to a place and be like, that's good enough. Right? And that is the trap. Like, that is hell too. It's not just going down, it's getting caught in a cycle where you just stay there. Like, you get to a point where your life is getting better, and then all of a sudden you get to a certain point and you're like, okay, I'm good. Like, I'm just going to stay here because I don't want to have to continue the painful process of change and growth and transformation. So I just want to stay right here. And we can get caught in those kinds of cycles. And here's the thing that's so scary about this is, the idea of hell, the concept of hell. People have a hard time believing in this concept of hell, but And it's understandable, but I think a lot of that is because almost because we don't want to believe that it could be true, right? Like, we always want to believe that we could break free, right? We can overcome anything. We can always be better ourselves. We can always change. We can always grow, and like, that's the hopeful sort of view that we have. And we need to hold that view because, so long as there's life, there is hope. But I think in our most honest moments, I think if we're being perfectly honest, I think it is very conceivable that there could be a state that one could get to where you become so entrenched in a particular cycle of thinking, right? A particular way of being, a particular pattern, a circle that you've been stuck in for so long that you could actually get so stuck as to be there forever. Like, I think that's conceivable. And some people might not think so. Maybe some people say, no, you can always break free. But I don't know, because, we even know this, even sort of like, neurobiologically, right? It shows that even mentally, like, by repeating the same patterns over and over again, those repeated patterns become habits. They become habit forming, and then they actually form neurological grooves, right? We talk about getting stuck in a rut, right? Like, literally, you can get stuck in a pattern of thinking. And if you stay in that pattern long enough, it seems conceivable to me anyway that you could actually get stuck in that permanently. And that's hell. Like, that's what hell would be. And so we want to think about, each of these different circles of hell, right? They're depicted as being a different sin, right? Or a different way of missing the mark, or a different kind of destructive pattern, or something that's, whether it's pride, or whether it's lust, or whether it's greed, or whether it's lies. Like, all of these different depictions in the story are just people who've gotten caught in a pattern. And that's where we have to be really careful, that we always need to be checking ourselves and be like, okay, what are the patterns that are forming themselves in my life, and where do I need to descend, and where am I kind of stalling the ascent, and where do I need to begin that process back? To bring it back to, so we're going to bring it back. So we talked about the Inferno here. Let's bring it back to The Office, okay? Let's bring it back to the comedy sort of side of things here, which is that this is essentially what the comedy and the story of The Office is that The Office essentially is, in many ways, it is this modern state of this corporate limbo, you could say. It is this corporate world where people have gotten stuck in patterns. And this is the joke. Like, this is what's funny about it, because you see people in the office playing out these patterns over and over and over again. And you always think like, oh, maybe they're going to break free. Like, maybe they're going to do something different. And then no, they just do the same thing, but they do it in a slightly different way, but they just repeat the same cycles over and over again. And we can see this in ourselves. We can see this in people in our lives. You know, it's like we laugh, we joke because we see these same sorts of cycles, but they're the things that trap us. They're the things that can cause us to essentially just get stuck in those kinds of places. And so just to describe for you a few of the examples of this in The Office, the main character that everybody knows is, of course, Michael Scott, who is, of course, our main character. He's the boss of The Office. He's played, wonderfully by Steve Carell. And so Michael Scott is the boss of The Office. And the thing about him is that he wants to be the world's best boss. Like, he really, really wants it. But he's constantly self-sabotaging himself and essentially making himself the world's worst boss in his attempt. And the reason why this happens is because he's caught in this pattern of constantly seeking approval, seeking attention, and seeking appreciation. He wants to be appreciated. He wants to be loved. He needs to be the center of attention all the time. And so he's constantly doing all of these ridiculous things to try to get everybody to love him and pay attention to him and all of that. And in so doing, he's constantly self-sabotaging and causing people to just be annoyed with him and constantly and it's very, very funny. But it's also kind of sad at the same time, and that's where that cringe sort of factor comes in. And then we see another character, which is his sort of sidekick. There's kind of his second in command, his right-hand man, who is Dwight Schrute, played famously by Rainn Wilson. And Dwight Schrute, in a lot of ways, is kind of one of the most iconic characters of The Office, who is this character of, he's a character who is constantly reaching for what's above, right? He's the assistant. He calls himself the assistant regional manager, and then Michael always has to correct him and be like, no, you're the assistant to the regional manager. And he's like, oh yeah, right. But that's his character in a nutshell. He's always trying to get up a little higher. He's constantly driven by ambition and sort of this reaching and striving for power. And so he's always trying to get, this thing or play this angle and all of the rest. And he's extremely single-minded. He's always has this very rigid, single-minded, almost kind of militant sort of way of being. And it's that which is most hilarious, because he can't see himself. He can't see how ridiculous he is. He can't see things that are in his periphery or that are right in front of him, because he's always so single-minded. And so there's other characters who are always playing pranks on him, and he never sees it coming because he's always so serious and he's always so focused. And then suddenly he realizes that, yeah, he's the butt of the joke again. And that's Dwight Schrute. And he's it's very, very funny. And there's moments where he actually tries to take over the office, and he tries to seize power from Michael. And we see in those moments that he's very limited in his ability to actually have empathy and compassion for people, because he's just so rigid and so this way. But at a certain point, at certain moments, we do see little cracks in the armor. We see these moments where he actually shows a little bit of sweetness. And one of those ways in which he shows this is that he enters into a relationship with another character at a certain point in the series, which is this character of Angela. And Angela is sort of the Lady Macbeth to his Macbeth, you could say. She is essentially, her thing that she is caught in, right? The cycle of hell that she's sort of stuck in is self-righteousness. She's actually the only character on the show that is depicted as being overtly religious, tellingly enough, right? In very much the same way that Dante places in the Inferno. He actually Dante depicts the Pope as being in hell, right? Which got him in all kinds of hot water. Well, hot water. I think he actually got exiled, and so had to like run for his life because of his comedy, right? Because that's what comedy does, right? Comedy, takes the tyrant and and shows him for what he is, right, or what he might be. And tyrants don't like that. But Angela is this sort of like religious. She's essentially, a hypocritical religious sort of character she's got to have everything right. She's got to have everything perfect. She can't have any fun, right? So people are joking around, and she's always, got that serious, sort of expression, and she's looking at them. But the joke about it is that she doesn't really realize this about herself. Like she thinks that she's actually fun. She has so kind of positioned herself in the office so that she is the head of the party planning committee, right? So she's put herself in charge of planning all the parties. The person who has no sense of humor and has no sense of fun is the one in charge of planning the parties. And if that isn't a lampooning of the corporate world, I don't know what is. But it's very hilarious, and it's great. And so she and Dwight end up kind of getting together and working through some of their stuff. And then there's various other kind of side characters. There's Meredith, who is kind of like the alcoholic of the office. So she's representative of addiction, and she's got some issues with being promiscuous and those kinds of things. We see of course as well, we see Kevin who is sort of representative of self-indulgence. He has this big thing of like M&Ms that he keeps on his desk so that nobody else can have them, right? Because he wants them to himself, and he's depicted as being he's got kind of a 12-year-old sense of humor, and he's into gambling, so he's that kind of self-indulgent sort of thing. So we see all these different kinds of characters, and they're all sort of stuck in their own little cycles. And then in the midst of all of that, it's sort of a in a lot of ways, it is kind of a satire of these kinds of characters, right? And we can kind of see them all around us in the world, and maybe in ourselves at times as well. But in a lot of ways, it's also a satirization of the corporate world that keeps us stuck in those patterns. And this is really interesting because we live in a time where we're living in a world now where everything has become gamified and fine-tuned so as to play to our vices in a lot of ways, right? Like advertisement and social media and the patterns of the world, and even the homes that we live in and the jobs that we work and the offices, these kinds of things. They've been sort of kind of fine-tuned and engineered so as to basically be constantly presenting us with things that we want, right? They're kind of always like advertising to the things that we want, and there's comforts, right? There's this sense of comfort in the world around us. It's a world of materialism. It's a world of comfort and sameness, and just that kind of creates these little bubbles, these little artificial bubbles, these little cubicles that we can live in that essentially insulate us from pain. They insulate us from pain, and they kind of dull in our desire for something more, and they keep us sort of stuck, and they keep us kind of trapped in these cycles of constantly kind of like tickling us with these little desires for things and for the kinds of stuff that just sort of keeps us looped in and keeps us from moving on. Like that's the world that we live in, and that's essentially what the office is. It's this world where everybody's sort of stuck in this sort of pattern, but the corporate world, the modern world, continuously perpetuates this pattern. And the question is, how do we break free? Like this is the world that many of us live in. In fact, all of us live in to some degree or another. How do we break free from the patterns that keep us stuck in these cycles? And in the story of The Office, we see these two kind of main characters, you could say, are the sort of representative of the everyman or the everywoman, and they're represented by Jim and Pam. Jim, who is this sort of lower end, salesman who kind of slowly works his way up the corporate ladder, and he has this famous like deadpan expression where he'll like look at the camera and be like, he does that, and that's the typical Jim. We're kind of seeing the world through his eyes, and we're like, what are we doing here, right? And then there's Pam, right? And Pam is the receptionist who is an artist. She's secretly an artist. She wants to be an artist, but she's just kind of stuck in this sort of dead-end job, you could say. And both of them are also stuck in patterns, right? Pam is in a relationship with it's kind of this dead-end, abusive, semi-abusive relationship that she's in, but she's been in, limbo and stuck in this holding cycle for, a long, long time. And then Jim, who is actually secretly in love with Pam, but he's afraid, right? So he's afraid of being rejected, right? So he can't bring himself to express his feelings. And Pam, who is, she's stuck, but she wants to pursue her career. She wants to become an artist. She wants to take classes and all that, but she's afraid. She's afraid of, like, well, what if I fail? It's like, these are the fears that keep us from making the descent, from going down, from leaving the job, or from, being in a relationship where we know that it's like, yeah, this is not good for me, or I'm in a pattern that I know isn't good for me, but I'm too afraid to make the move. And so they're stuck in this sort of thing as well. But slowly, as the show progresses, as the story goes on, they begin to break free. And we sort of follow their story sort of slowly as they are going through these cycles, and they make the descent. They begin to break things apart in their lives that are kind of holding them back. And then slowly they come together with one another and can help each other forward in this kind of cycle. And like, that's what we need, right? Because none of us is in this journey alone, right? Even with Dante, he needs Virgil to lead him along on the way, and we need each other. We need one another to constantly be helping us along on the journey. And there's ways in which we can help each other to break free of some of the cycles that we experience. And there's really kind of two ways that we can break free of these kinds of cycles that we entrap ourselves. And the first one is that we need to cultivate desire. And the second one is that we need to experience pain. And both of these are two things that we kind of actually try to insulate ourselves from in the modern world. And we've actually become very effective at insulating ourselves from this, because we need desire, because it's kind of like the old adage of the carrot and the stick, right? Like, we only change, we only grow, we only move on in our lives when we either see something that looks so good that we just have to have it, or because we're in so much pain and so much misery in the situation that we're in that we're like, you know what? Anything is better than this. I've got to move. I've got to get up. I've got to go. Like, that's what helps us to move forward. And when we think about desire and when we think about pain, we're living in a world that has insulated us from both of those things. We constantly are essentially titillating ourselves. The world around us is constantly titillating us with little tiny hits of pleasure. Right? These are the little dopamine hits that we get when we scroll on our phone, right? Or when we are just kind of, shopping online, or when we're perusing through things, or we just get this constant sense of a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of pleasure, and it dullens our sense of desire. Like, we're never hungry enough to actually want something, like, we just are constantly like, oh yeah, another French fry, another little bit of junk food. Like, junk food is the symbol essentially of the world that we live in, right? It's this constant McDonald's of just, here's all of these different options, and here's all these little things that you can just do to just kind of make yourself sort of happy, but it's not real joy, right? It's just these little things. And in the same way, we deaden our pain, right? There's all these little things that we do to kind of dull our pain, deaden our pain, insulate us from any kind of like actual discomfort or fear or misery or suffering in any way. But like, we need suffering, we need pain sometimes to actually tell us that something needs to change in our lives. And so we need to do our best to actually break free of the bubble wrap, right? Like, we need to actually get out of that. And the way that we can do that, or something that can help us with this, is other people. And so like, The Office is an instance, and it's an example of this sort of, you could say, this sort of hellish environment where everybody is sort of stuck in these circles. But at the same time, there is the opportunity, so long as there are other people around us, there's this opportunity that we can actually break free, because people around us poke us, don't they, right? We see in the story of Jim, right, as Jim and Pam are kind of beginning this journey, and then some of the other characters begin to break free as well, Dwight and Michael and so forth. Jim and Dwight are always poking each other. They're always nagging each other or playing pranks on each other or bothering each other or irritating each other. And we see other characters irritating one another in various ways. And like, we don't like that. Like, we like to try to insulate ourselves from those kinds of people. But we need those people in our lives because those are the people that actually, like, they bother us. Like, they rub us the wrong way. And it's only by experiencing irritation and discomfort that we learn things about ourselves, that we discover things about our situation that actually need to change. We need to experience those kinds of things. And we also need the people in our lives that help to create desire, that to help to fan into flame desire. And most obviously in the office, we see it with Pam and Jim, right? That they are attracted to one another, that they have desire. Jim helps motivate Pam to pursue her art, right? He's like, oh, wow, what you did is great. Like, that's a beautiful picture that you drew there. And she's like, oh, and it's like that little bit of encouragement that she needed to create the desire of like, oh, maybe I could do that again. Maybe I could do more with this. And we need the people in our lives to create desire and also at times to even, to facilitate a little bit of pain in our lives. And the thing that I think we want to think about here is that we need to remember how much we need each other, and we need to avoid the temptation to just put ourselves in these kinds of echo chambers. This is the thing that's so scary in the modern world, where it's like we've created a world where we can and do oftentimes through the algorithms and through the very small social circles that we inhabit, right? That are breaking down and becoming these like little social silos that we live in and so forth. And the social media that feeds us the same stuff that we've already believe in and surrounds us and suggests for us information or news articles or whatever that already align themselves to our own particular way of seeing things in the world. Like, these are devices that get us stuck in circles, that get us stuck in cycles. What we need is difference. We need people that are different in our lives. We need exposure to different viewpoints. We need exposure to things that are outside of the circle of hell that we inhabit. Like, we need to actually be willing, and it might mean going down or it might mean going up, but we need to actually break free from some of those things. And so as we are inhabiting this kind of space, we need to resist the temptation to insulate ourselves and go within ourselves, because there's a way of seeing hell. This is really important. There's a way of seeing hell as not a place that's sort of out there, but rather as a place that's in here. That there's a way of seeing hell as a bottomless pit that goes down, 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 down into ourselves. That we begin to go inward. We collapse inward, down, 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 until all the way at the bottom, right? What's at the bottom? The devil's at the bottom, and he's alone, right? He's alone, and we go within ourselves. Again, C.S. Lewis, in another of his wonderful stories, in The Great Divorce, he depicts hell as being this city where people are constantly separating themselves out from everybody else because they just can't get along. And we are doing that. And we need to fight that impulse to just separate ourselves out, or to go inward, or to collapse down into ourselves. And we need people who pull us up out of ourselves, who bring us out into community, who bring us out of the pit into that place, into that open space where we can actually have difference and communication and beauty and all of those kinds of things. It's the same. It's the waking up, right? This is what we talked about with Odysseus when we think about the story of the Odyssey, that Odysseus falls asleep, that he loses his way and he has to wake up. This is Neo in the Matrix, that he has to wake up out of the Matrix. And the question is, will he just go back to sleep, right? When we experience people poking us, or some of these experiences in our lives that maybe awaken desire in us in some way, there's a temptation to want to go back to sleep, to just go back to that same cycle again. Will we do that, or will we choose to take the next step, right? Whether that's descending or ascending, like do we have the courage to begin to break free from that and continue the journey? And that's what we want to do, because the danger is staying in those patterns for too long is habit forming, and we can become caught in these cycles and just continue and continue and continue and continue. And so the question is to us, will we become sort of the denizens of the office, right? Will we become people who are just satisfied with so-so, right? Will we just inhabit that sort of mediocre space that is not great, it's not here, it's not there, it's just sort of one of the circles of hell? Will we just do that forever, whatever that looks like in our lives? Or will we, like Dante, merely be visitors in hell who say, I'm going to go all the way down. I'm willing to go to the bottom. I'm willing to face my demons. I'm willing to go all the way down and see what is at the bottom of myself, and then begin the ascent back up again, and to engage with culture, and to engage with people, and even the people that are irritating in our lives, because they're those that draw us up out of ourselves. And so those are some of the questions that I think we can leave ourselves with. And so I would just ask for you, what are those things in your life, right? What are the circles that maybe that you get stuck in? Like, what are some of the cycles that repeat themselves over and over in your life, and the temptation to stay there? What are some of the things that maybe can put you to sleep at times, and maybe cause you to continue to stay numb and stay stuck in those places? And what are the things that help you to break free? What are some of the things that might help to wake you up out of that state of sleep and to move on to the next thing? And so what would that next thing look like in your life? What is the next circle that you're moving towards? And so maybe it's up, maybe it's down, but we are the ones who get to choose. We are the ones who are on the journey, and we get to decide, am I going to continue to stay in the place that I'm at, or will I have the courage to move forward, whether that's downward or upward? And so I would just leave you with that. And so I would encourage you, stay on the journey, right? Don't get stuck in one place, because there's more out ahead, that the journey continues onward. And so long as we are willing to continue to change and continue to grow, and to go after the things that we desire, and to experience the pain that motivates us onward, then we can continue the journey, whether that's up the spiral or whether it's down. But one way or the other, we can find our way up and out of the places that we find ourselves trapped. And so I would encourage you with that, to continue the journey, and I look forward to seeing you again here soon.